Welcome back to a Market Down Monday on Buckeye Talk. Doug Lamorese, Nathan Baird, Stephen Means. Who will lead Ohio State in sacks in 2023? This is not the same thing as who will be their best defensive lineman. It's not even necessarily the same thing as who will be their best pass rusher. But we are in this situation, this era, Nathan, where it's been a little weird the past couple years. Last year, Jack Sawyer and Mike Hall Jr. tied for the Ohio State lead with 4.5 sacks each. In 2021, Haskell Garrett led them with 5.5. 2020 was short. It was weird. Jonathan Cooper led them with 3.5. But this is before that. 2019, Chase Young, 16.5, the school record. 2018, Young, 10.5. 2017, Nick Bosa, 8.5. 2016 and 2015, Tyquan Lewis, 8 each year. 2014, Joey Bosa, 13.5. Noah Spence, 8 in 2013. So in the 7 years between 2013 and 2019, the team leader had no fewer than 8 in any of those years. And 3 times the leader was in double figures. Since then, well, throughout 2020, but the leader 5.5 and 4.5. Nathan, isn't that low? Like, let's start there. Like, should Ohio State's sack leader have more than 4.5 or 5.5 sacks?
So what I think some other data that we look at will tell you that collectively in a lot of these years, even last year, for example, Ohio State's sack rate as a team was not that bad. But clearly what they've been missing has been a next level individual edge rusher. I don't think you can possibly argue against that. There's been little flashes of it. The one big JT Tuimoloau game, the couple of games that Tyreek Smith had in 2021 where he was really great. But it hasn't been a sustained thing through a season. And this sort of crystallized for me a little bit very recently when we were recording a Retalkables for the 2016 Ohio State-Michigan game and looking at that defensive front and how many just talented NFL-bound guys were on that defensive line. And in theory, Ohio State keeps doing that. But, like, where's the guy that really scares you? I remember a couple of plays that Nick Bosa as a true freshman made in that game where you're like, okay, you feel that. Like, are you feeling anybody off of Ohio State's defensive line enough? And I think it's a fair conversation when you're talking about the margins that Ohio State wants to play at, the level that Ohio State wants to play at, that it's fair to point out that even if collectively it's a pretty good pass rush, is it an elite pass rush? And more importantly, are you finding and then developing that guy who can really wreak havoc? Because we've seen it be such an element of successful Ohio State teams.
So this is not the podcast. Is their pass rush pretty good? That's not the podcast. The podcast is who will lead them in sacks. But we're going to wind up talking about things like, is their pass rush pretty good? Because it's so weird, Stephen. It's almost impossible because, and then we blame Chase Young. They had 54 sacks in 2019 to lead the nation. Then in 2021 and 2022, they're like in the mid-30s nationally with where they rank. They had 36 sacks in 2021, and I believe they had 34 sacks last year. But when you have a season, Stephen, with 54 sacks, it throws off your view of what it's supposed to be. And I still think that's affecting us. It's affecting the fan base when we think of, pass rush, man, what's up? We can't expect 54, but I don't know what the right number is. It feels like it's something below 54, but higher than the mid-30s.
I think every year leading up to 2019 is reasonable. The problem, Chase Young, is this Chase Young's fault. He had that year and then it fell off a cliff. It wasn't a gradual descent where you could blame it on, okay, over time, the talent in the room maybe fell off a little bit. And so that's why, once the last of the 2019 roster was gone, that's why it got so bad as it got. No, it was like immediately he left and so did the sacks. And that doesn't make much sense. And as much as we want to put on a defensive line, because this is what we're going to be talking about for most of the time, it's hard because the sacks went out the window, so did the coverage ability. And it's like a thing of like what came first, the chicken or the egg, when you're talking about the front end and the back end working together. Would Ohio State have had 5 more sacks a year the last couple of years if they had someone at Jeff Okudah's level? in the back end, also helping to also, making a quarterback hold the ball an extra half a second? Or is it just Chase Young's that awesome? Because that's the thing. We've seen the Chase Youngs, the Nick Bosa's, the Joey Bosa's, and into the next level, Tyquan Lewis, Jalen Holmes, Sam Hubbard. But paired with each of those guys is a Jeff Okuda, a Marshawn Lattimore, a Bradley Roby, a Denzel Ward, and then to the next level, Damon Arnett, Garyon Conley. So it's hard because both of those things went out the window together. So you can't really say which has had more of an impact on why the sheer numbers are down, even if the sack rate is the exact same.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's why when we have these conversations, it's not only about the talent and skill of the defensive line. It's about, can the defense get sacks? Can other people help the best individual pass rusher get home to the quarterback more often? We've had a lot of discussions over the past couple of years about getting home. I asked this of the texters. Does Ohio State need to get more sacks this season than it has the last few years? The Buckeyes had 34 last year and 36 in 2021 compared to 54 in 2019. Possibilities are no. The pass rush and sack totals the past 2 years are enough for them to win. Yes, the Buckeyes absolutely need more sacks to be a national title team, or the pass rush needs to be better, but constant pressure matters, not sacks. Like I'm a pass rush guy, but I think sacks get overrated as a stat. I'm almost opting out of the sack question kind of thing. And I will say that nobody thinks the last 2 years are good enough. Literally 0%. 75%, yes, the Buckeyes need more sacks. 25%, it's really more about pressure and not sack numbers. Nathan, I would vote more sacks. Yes, I understand other things. I understand whatever. I vote more sacks. Would you vote more sacks, Nathan?
I would vote more sacks. Now, there are some nerdy things we can get into as far as the fact that last year's pass rush was actually, as a team, the best it's been since 2019, and it didn't show up. I wrote a thing mid-season last year. They were on this pace to have this really low sack total. It's because they weren't facing any passes. Like, you have to have a pass attempt in order to have a sack. It's a chicken before the egg thing that's happening there. So you have to look at pass rush. But it kind of goes to what I was saying before, that we know it when we see it. I think you know it when you feel it too. You feel it from the press box. You feel it through your television, that there is an intimidation factor and there is a violence factor. I don't know how else to say it, that is missing. It can't just be, and I agree with Steven, though, that I think that they do need help. It has to be a progression from the front, and it has to be a progression from the back. It's not coincidental that these spikes happen in 2019. That really ruins the curve on when you're looking at sack rate for Ohio State in the playoff era, because it was Chase Young, and it was also the best collection of secondary talent they've had since then, and a defensive coordinator who was a secondary guy, and I think coached those guys up to another level. I think those things worked in concert that year to come up with a special year. But I think that what they did last year was good, but it wasn't elite. And Ohio State, and everything it does, wants to be elite, and it's got to get better. It's got to get home more often to be elite.
Would you vote more sacks, Steven?
Easily. 2nd and 17 really helps the defense out. If every 3rd and 7, an offensive coordinator is scrambling on what to call because he has to worry about getting sacked, that only helps this defense. I think that the whole are sacks as a stat overrated is a conversation that we can only be having with Ohio State if they were like 10th in the country last year. If they were where USC was, literally, they had 40 sacks last year, but we don't know USC for their defense, then we could say, okay, lack of sacks isn't the issue. When you're middle of the road in your own conference and getting sacks, that is the issue, regardless of whether you think the actual stat is overrated or not.
So Nathan, it is hard for me. We're going to get into your nerdy numbers here in a second. They just have lists of sacks. They put names in a list and they say, look at all the sack people. Last year, the Ohio State leader in sacks, again, Mike Hall and Jack Sawyer, they tied for 13th in the Big Ten. So there were 12 guys that had 5 sacks or more in the Big Ten, led by Nick Herbig of Wisconsin with 11. So, like you said, Nathan, the standard at Ohio State is like, hey, let's look at the sack list. Oh, nobody from Ohio State's higher than 13th. Okay, I don't know. That seems kind of weird. The year before, Haskell Garrett had 5.5. That was tied for 13th. So there's like a bunch of dudes, another 12 guys ahead of him. Aiden Hutchinson had 14. David Ajabo had 11. Arnold Ebiketie at Penn State had 9.5. Nick Herbig again had 9. Leo Chenal at Wisconsin had 8. Boy Mafe at Minnesota had 7. Lucas Van Ness, who winds up a first-round pick, he had 7 in 2021 at Iowa, and he had 6 at Iowa last year. I don't know. Does that matter? Is that a fair thing to look at, or are teams throwing more against those teams? Because part of the other thing is, like, I know, so we'll get to maybe Ohio State's not facing passing teams as much, but they also get leads and then force teams to pass, and then can't they tee off in the pass rush a little bit? I'm just surprised. As much as the nerdy numbers, we don't mean to say nerdy, the more sophisticated stats will tell us some stuff. I'm still just surprised. How can nobody on this team have more than 5 sacks? I'm still just surprised.
No, I think that is a very fair way to look at this. I mean, so here, I want to look at a couple numbers real quick. So 2021, this team had a sack rate 7.24%, and they had 36 sacks compared to last year's 34. But remember that like 9 of those came against Akron or whatever. So right there, that can tell you that when you're looking over a course of a season, one season, small sample size, sack numbers can get skewed. Last year, even though they had 2 fewer sacks, same number of games, their sack rate was actually 8.63%. That's 1.4% higher. It's a huge jump. They were, as a team, significantly better at getting sacks last year than they were in 2021, even though they had fewer sacks as a team. I know that is a weird thing here. And it's actually a better number than their average year during the playoff era, which is 8.31%. If you take out 2019, which I said before, ruins a curve, that's actually only 7.85%. So you're talking about getting close to like 2 sacks per game higher than their average year during the playoff era. So again, I think last year would be considered a successful pass rush year for Ohio State, even compared to its own standard. But that's because it has had a couple of years, these last couple of years. Did I just say that? The past couple of years, it has fallen off of its own standard. It's dragged that number down a little bit. And you haven't seen, someone like Zach Harrison, we've talked a billion times, very strong football player overall, deserving 3rd-round pick of the Atlanta Falcons, not an elite pass rusher. JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer, very good football players, have not shown themselves to be elite pass rushers yet. We know what it is. We've seen it at Ohio State. And not just Chase Young. And not just even the Bosa brothers. There have been other guys sprinkled in there that have been excellent at this, and it's not showing up statistically for Ohio State at an elite level from individual guys the way it has other players. So I think it's a fair thing to say that just because this team, again, is performing at a very good rate overall from a sack rate perspective, that there is something else that a defense gets when an offense has to adjust to a guy who is killing them. And we've seen, I will say we haven't, I guess, necessarily seen a lot of teams do it to Ohio State, but we have. We saw it in 2021. Like when Aiden Hutchinson, for the most part, and David Ajabo helping him, but when Hutchinson alone was just doing what he did against Ohio State that day, it changed the complexion of everything. It changed the complexion of a rivalry. And if Ohio State has to go find an answer to that on defense, I think it has to unlock something in one of these guys and start unleashing them. I mean, I guess at least one of these guys, maybe more, and start unleashing them on offenses. And I don't know that it's something schematically that's held them back. I think it's just a developmental thing. And now we've got a couple guys going into their 3rd year, and maybe it's their time.
Not, and this may be a little bit of a cop-out answer, but how much of this is Ohio State's reputation over a decade now playing against itself? Where, I mean, teams are not. You only have so many years where teams are just going to sit back there and let you sack them. And not saying that they were letting Chase and Nick and Joey sack them, but after a while, you do adjust to that. And it does still feel like, especially around the Big Ten, there is this reverence for the defensive line development at Ohio State in a way that if you're an offensive coordinator, you're probably getting the ball out that much quicker than you would on all the 11 other weeks that you play football, because history has showed you for the past 10 years that if Larry Johnson is there, you can't sit back there and just, play deep ball. It's got to be quick stuff because you can't give these guys the opportunity. So when you mix that with maybe these guys aren't Chase Young level, or even yet when you're talking about JT and Jack, because they are still just coming into their third year, you combine all those things of the overall superstar defensive end has been lacking, but also the opportunity for the guy right under the overall superstar to be at least a star hasn't been there as well. Because we mentioned the Bosa's with Sam Hubbard. I would say that Zach Harrison is the same level of defensive end as Sam Hubbard and Jalen Holmes and maybe Tyquan Lewis. I mean, the NFL draft literally showed us that. They were day 2 draft picks. Would those guys have the same exact type of sack numbers that Zach Harrison had the last 4 years if this was their reality, or vice versa? Would Zach Harrison have had better numbers playing in that era where that reputation hadn't been built up so highly?
And Sam Hubbard and Tyquan Lewis were really never asked to be the best defensive ends on their team.
Yeah.
Like, they were always playing with the Bosa. So I think that's part of it. What if Zach Harrison played with the Bosa? I think that's reasonable. I do think maybe Sam Hubbard is more explosive, get after the passer. Like, Zach Harrison might be better against the run. And again, we're not. The real conversation here is not how good you are; it's how good you are at getting to the quarterback, and that's not every part of a defensive end or defensive tackle's responsibility.